perfect lighting. One last thing before we go into tonal control. I'm often asked, should I shoot on autofocus or manual? I strongly recommend that you turn off the autofocus on your camera and only shoot using manual focus. When you focus an image using manual focus and put the camera down to answer a phone call or to step away from the patient for a moment, you can pick your camera back up and walk forward or back into focus. If your camera is set at autofocus, the moment you depress the shutter even a little bit, you'll go back into focus no matter where you are. This is particularly important when I'm shooting left and right lateral images or any other matched pair of images to make sure that the magnification is always the same. Let's take a minute to talk about great tonal control. You see, no matter what kind of camera you use, whether it's an SLR or a point and shoot, we're going to have great lighting. Great tonal control is a function of understanding how to adjust the amount of light we send out via the flash, as well as controlling the amount of light we let in using the camera settings. As I mentioned earlier, there are some considerable differences between point and shoots and digital SLRs. One of the biggest differences between the two types of cameras is that most digital SLR cameras have a tool called a histogram. This instrument is what we rely on for understanding the tonal makeup of the image. Imagine for a moment that you owned an apple orchard, and in your orchard you grew both red and yellow apples. Imagine for a moment that this orchard also grows any combination of red and yellow apples. If I asked you to take the reddest apple in the orchard and place it in an empty barrel on the left side, and then asked you to take the yellowest apple in your orchard and place it in a barrel on the right side, that would act as a great guide for every other apple in the orchard. Now imagine that I asked you to take every single apple grown in that orchard and place it in one of 255 empty barrels using the absolute reddest and absolute yellowest as a guide. At the end of the day, you would have 255 barrels filled with some number of apples. Furthermore, imagine if we took the x-axis and used the color of an apple from red to yellow and any combination therein, and used the y-axis as the number of apples in each barrel, we could produce a graph that would tell us exactly the makeup of that particular orchard. Well, a histogram is no different. In a blink of an eye, your camera analyzes every single pixel in your 8, your 10, or 12 million pixel image and categorizes it based upon the pure black on the left side and pure white on the right, and any combination of red, green, and blue that make up the other colors in your output device. Now, when we talk about red, green, and blue, you may also know it as RGB. By looking at the histogram, one can tell what's in the image. Let's try one. In looking at this histogram, we can see that the biggest, broadest peak, or the most pixels that are represented, are somewhere on the lighter side of the image, correct? The bright white is on the right, the pitch black is on the left, so the broadest peak is slightly right of center, meaning that it's leaning a little bit towards the lighter side of the scale. So whatever we have here is not bright white, but is on the lighter side. We also have some pixels to the left of center, which means that there are some darker colors represented in this picture. Let's see what we're looking at. Well, it's just a tooth. However, let's take it apart piece by piece. If you look at the histogram, you'll notice that on the right side, there's a tiny little spike. That's made up of the glimmering coming off of the tooth. It's sort of a mirror-like appearance, and it doesn't make up much of our image, but it's clearly there. Histograms don't lie, they show us everything. The biggest, broadest peak is made up of all the ivory color that the crown of the tooth represents. If we look further to the left, we'll notice that there's some darker colors that are represented. Those are the rubber dam and the rubber dam clamp, which don't make up much of the image, but certainly are there. Clearly, if you look at the picture and look at the histogram, they do represent one another rather well. Let's take a look at a second histogram. When looking at this shot, you can see that there is a little bit less of a peak on the right side and a little bit more of a peak on the left side. What do you think this means? Well, it clearly means there are more darker pixels represented in this image. Let's take a look and see what it is. Well, it's just a crown prep. However, the big difference between this image and the one we just looked at is that in this case, the tooth takes up less of the frame. That allows us to look at more rubber dam and more clamp, which are darker. So when you look at the histogram, you'll still see the peak right of center, where the ivory-colored tooth takes up most of the pixels. But on the left side, we'll be able to see more blue and darker gray because the image isn't taken up entirely by tooth. As you can see, the histogram is very representative of what we're looking at in the image. Let's try one more. You'll notice that this histogram is very different than the first two. It's got a much better balance between the light on the right side and the dark on the left. What could it possibly be? Well, in looking at the image, you can see why we have more pixels on the right side than on the left. What is there more of, snow or trees? There's more snow. Snow is white. There are more white pixels on the right side than there are dark pixels making up the trees on the left. That's what we'd expect. So as you can see, a histogram is extremely representative of the image we're looking at. And as you'll see in a little bit, that's the key to us getting perfect tonal control on every image. Now that you know what a histogram is, it's time to learn what we do with it. We want to shoot all of our images with the biggest, broadest peak directly in the center of our histogram. However, you're not going to always be able to do that. So if we're going to err, let's err to the left, to the darker side, so that the biggest, broadest peak is to the left of center. Let's think of it like X-rays. What can you do more with, a dark X-ray or a light X-ray? A dark X-ray allows us a lot more options, and so we'll do the same with our images. If we can't get the biggest, broadest peak directly in the center, let's err to the left just a little bit. So now you know what a histogram is and what we want to do with it. The problem is, right now you're probably asking yourself, how do I get the biggest, broadest peak to be where I want it? There are only two ways that you can control the lighting of your images, either through the amount of light you send out via flash or through the amount of light you let into the camera through the f-stop or aperture settings. Remember before when I told you to set your camera on the aperture priority? That was so that you could use your f-stops along with your flash to control the lighting of your images. Let's talk a little bit about f-stops. The f-stop is a little tricky for some people to understand because it doesn't make sense right off the bat. The higher the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture will be and the less light it lets into the camera. It's a little counterintuitive. It's actually a ratio, and think of 1/32 being smaller than 1/2. If you take away the ones, a 32 is much smaller than a 2. You see, the higher the f-stop, the less light is let in, and the darker our image will appear. I always tell everyone to think about it a little bit like sunscreen. If you're going to go out on a bright sunny day, you're going to use sunscreen with a high SPF. If it's not quite so bright, you'll use a sunscreen with a little bit of a lower SPF. I want you to think about your images the same way. If there's a lot of bright light being thrown onto your image, use a higher f-stop, which will let in less light. If there's not a lot of light being thrown onto your image, I want you to use a smaller f-stop, letting in more light onto the image. Again, let's go through this one more time. If the peak of the histogram is too far to the left, does that mean our image was too dark or too light? Correct, it's too dark. And we want to make the f-stop higher or lower to let in more light. We want to make it lower. Conversely, if the peak of the histogram is too far to the right, does that mean our image was too light or too dark? It's too light. And do we want to make the f-stop higher or lower to let in less light? We want to make it higher. By now, you've learned what a histogram is, where we want the biggest peak to be, and how to control it using your f-stop or aperture. However, there's one more thing to learn, and that's how to control our flash. Now, you may recall from earlier, I did say that a good flash for dental use should have at least 3 settings. It should have a full power, otherwise known as M or 1:1, depending upon your system. It should also have 1/4 of that amount, and 1/16 or 1/32 or something less than 1/4. Unfortunately, a lot of point-and-shoot cameras don't allow this ability. Another reason why I like digital SLRs for dental photography. You see, once you can control the flash, you have the ability to control the entire image because the higher the f-stop, the greater the depth of field. I want to give you an example of two different ways that we can take an image so that you can understand why controlling these things is so important. Imagine if we were going to take an image with the flash setting at M or 1:1 all the way up. Well, we'd be throwing a lot of bright light out on the image. As a result, we'd be forced to turn our f-stop or aperture all the way up to let in very little light to get a good histogram. As a result, we'd have fantastic depth of field. Now, when I say depth of field, that means how much can I see in the image as I look into it that's in focus at the same time. We can take the same exact image with a very low flash setting of, say, 1/32, letting in only a little light, so we'd have to turn our f-stop all the way down to let in more. Unfortunately, with a lower f-stop, our depth of field is greatly reduced. In both cases, we'd have a great histogram, but our first shot would have great depth of field showing all of the teeth in an arch in focus, and our second one would show only a couple of teeth in focus. Take a look at this image. You'll understand what I'm talking about. On the left, you'll notice a picture of a keyboard that was taken with very little light on a weak flash setting, which forced us to have a very low f-stop to let in a lot of light. You'll see that the tab button is totally in focus, but by the time we get to the Q key, it's already looking a little fuzzy. On the right side, you'll notice an image taken with a lot of light, a flash setting of M or 1:1. Because there was a lot of light, we had to turn our f-stop all the way up. As a result, we get a great depth of field. The tab key and the Q key are both in focus. Even the W is pretty clear, and if we look at the E, we can make out what it is. The distance of those four keys combined is approximately 4 inches. Think about that in relation to a dental arch. If we're off just a little bit in focusing on our centrals and are using a high f-stop, it's not a problem. Everything's still going to look great. If you're shooting your camera on TTL or through the lens, you may find that from time to time your camera has absolutely no idea what it's doing. You might get an image that's too bright or too dark. The problem is we're asking our cameras to meter in a way that they just can't. You see, the images we're taking are actually extreme. We're shooting pink and white from less than a foot away, and our camera metering systems have no idea what it is we want. So when we turn it over to the camera, the images sometimes are not going to work out the way we want. However, if we take control of the image, we'll have a perfect shot every time. So how do we pull together all the information I've just given you? It's easy. Just make what I call a cheat sheet. In front of you, you'll see an example of the one I use in my practice from my camera. You'll notice that it says that the flash setting for full face is set at M, or 1:1 or full, whatever your particular flash setting might be. I want you to take a patient or your assistant and take a full face image the way it should be taken. If you need to know more about that, my other DVD talks much more about composition. Once you shoot your image with the f-stop at 14, take a look at your histogram, which is on the back of your camera. Is it too far to the right or too far to the left? Shoot another image and see what it looks like. If it's still too light or too dark, keep adjusting your f-stops until you have a perfect image. Once you get to an image where the histogram is right in the middle and the image looks perfect, I want you to cross out the 14 on the cheat sheet and write in what the f-stop is now. Once you have all of your images shot to the way you want them to look, redo this entire sheet on a bright piece of paper, laminate it, and leave a copy in each of your operatories. That way, every single time you have a patient that needs images taken, you'll be able to set your camera up quickly and easily and make sure you have perfect tonal control for every single image. It's as easy as that. Of course, there are going to be cases where things are going to look a little different. Remember, your camera is just telling you what kind of pixels make up your image and whether they're more light or more dark based upon their color. If you have a patient in your practice who's African American, they're going to have more darker pixels. That's just their makeup. As opposed to someone who's Scandinavian, who's going to have more lighter pixels. Don't try to take the biggest, broadest peak on an African American patient and make it in the middle. You're going to have to let in so much light to make their pixels appear lighter that your image actually isn't going to look right. So sometimes common sense, when your image is off from the ones on your sheet, will be your best guide. Hopefully this DVD has helped you understand the basics of buying and setting up a camera for dental photography. Combining your knowledge of lighting in the dental environment from this DVD and composition tricks and tips from our last DVD should produce unparalleled results. It's my sincerest hope that you'll be able to grow your practice and see better clinical results by using clinical photography as a cornerstone of your practice. I'm Dr. Glenn Krieger, and I invite you to offer us any feedback at our website, www.betterdental.images.com, where you'll find other teaching DVDs and a full line of specialized mirrors and retractors to help you get the best images you possibly can.